Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today with Detective J. Warner Wallace. I'm real excited to be with him. He is a retired cold case homicide detective from LA. He has been on Dateline, Fox News, Court TV, many others that are out there. He's a former atheist, and he examined the claims of the New Testament using the skills of a criminal investigator. He looked at Christianity as a cold case, and he worked it. And after seeing the truth, he became a Christ follower at the age of 35. He got his master's in theology. He serves as a senior fellow of the Colson Center. Is just absolutely incredible. His signature book is called Cold Case Christianity. He's written other books. One of my personal favorites is Person of Interest, which I don't know if it was his last one or 2 books ago. But his latest book that we're going to talk about today is The Truth About True Crime, What Investigating Death Teaches Us About the Meaning of Life. The whole process, and if you ever hear him speak, I've heard him now a couple times, he really is focusing on the truth about things and not just about our feelings about things, which I think is so critical and refreshing during this time. So thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate you being here.
Well, so glad to be with you. You're right about, this idea of uncommon sense, like what used to be something, and a lot of this based on a worldview. Like, do we still hold a common worldview? If we do, then there'll be something called common sense. But as the worldviews start to collapse, that's when I think you see the diversity we're seeing now.
Yeah, it is shocking to me when I kind of listen to people and I watch myself, for example. I have not, but when I became a Christian, I've changed my worldview and how I looked at things differently. But there are a lot of things that I didn't change. But watching the world change around me, it was like I moved really far to the right by standing still. And it was like it just seemed kind of odd to me during this moment and watching what people are taking as true and not true. It seems to me to be a reflection of laziness, of not wanting to dig into truth, but that's the opposite of what you do. Would you agree that it's laziness that seems to do it? Because what you do obviously isn't lazy. Like, you have to dig and you have to take a piece, So explain kind of how you do this, both as a cold case detective and as a theologian, and how do you apply it? And do you think that other people should put forth more effort like that?
Well, I do think you're right about it. The unexamined life, right, is not worth living. So there is a point at which we wonder, why don't people examine where these ideas came from? Where even the ideas that we practice every day that we don't even realize are grounded in something we probably learned or we absorbed from the culture. Like, why aren't we more critical of our own approach to life? And you'll see this when you work murders. It's like the same 3 impulses. The same 3 motives recur again and again and again and again and again. And at some point, you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is pretty common sense stuff. If you had a certain number of principles in your mind, why do you think Jordan Peterson's book on 12 Rules for Life resonated with so many people? Well, a lot of it was because, wouldn't it be nice if there were just 12 rules for life? Because then we would know what they are. We would just obey them. Well, it turns out, long before there were 12 rules for life, there were 10 commandments for living. and so it turns out that most of us have been ignoring. And especially if we were raised in the church, if you were raised in the Christian worldview, it doesn't mean you're necessarily living it. So what I started to do was to collect, and you're right, I love the investigative side of writing books. And this is really, I was kind of raised as a loner, only child growing up with just my mom. My dad was a detective, had a lot of time by myself, loved the idea of just digging in deep into like, what is the data? Like, find me the data. And when you're working cold cases, that's what you're doing. You're spending years, collecting the data that will eventually, the facts, the evidence, that will eventually become part of a formal case in front of a jury. And if you're not the kind of person who loves that part of it, then this is not for you. You're going to find yourself bored quickly. You're going to find yourself, like, this is not exciting enough. But the digging through the evidence is the stuff that I love. So that's why we wrote this book. This book really is about digging through the evidence of what helps humans flourish, because it turns out there are 15 things that all the secular studies proclaim. Now, these are 15 things that you will see if you work cold cases. You'll see them if you work any true crime detective work. You will see the same 15 things over and over and over and over again. And you wonder, why is it we don't master these things? And so I just wanted to put it together. What are those 15 things? Because it turns out those 15 things are ancient. We think we've discovered them in the last 30 to 40 years. But the reality of it is, these are ancient principles we've just largely forgotten. And then when we discover them again, we're like, wow, look, I discovered this amazing, kind of surprising principle for human flourishing, which if you're talking to people who really know their Bible, they're like, that's not that surprising. I've seen that in Scripture a number of times. Well, that's the kind of stuff we wanted to talk about in the Truth and True Crime.
All right. So when you investigate a murder, obviously your thought process is, who did it? Maybe some why did they do it? Because I know that's not always critical, but it's helpful. And it kind of helps fulfill or a need that we have. Like I want to know why. There's like that we just seem like, and I think that's why so many people are fascinated by these true crime stories on TV and podcasts, et cetera. But never do I ever hear anybody until this book has come out of like, what are we learning about human nature behind it? That seems to should be more of an important question. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So here's what I would say, and I've been thinking about this a lot, even since I wrote the book. So, every crime has an explosive day in which something that shouldn't have been done gets done. And let's say, it's a spousal murder or something like this. But that day that happened, I talk about this in Person of Interest, was preceded by a long series of events that kind of ignited the bad day. The fuse that's burning en route to the bomb of the day in which the crime is committed. And afterwards, of course, there's all this fallout. Okay. Well, it turns out that if you examine the fuse, the things that cause us to do, you're going to learn something about human nature. Because you're right, the why question is huge in criminal trials. Now, I don't have an obligation to show why he did it.
Right.
Just that he did it. But I think when I'm first looking for somebody, I want to know, well, who's got a motive to do this? There's going to be somebody who's got a why that's going to end up doing this. You may not agree with the why, but they had in their mind a why. So what's interesting about the fuse, the days leading up to the crime, is that's going to show you something about human nature. What moves us? What do we care about? What motivates us to do good and bad? So the fuse leading up to a crime teaches you something about the nature of humans. Now, the other why that most of my victim families have, if they're believers, is not like why, not just why did he do it? It's probably even more metaphysical why. It's why, if there's a loving God who's all powerful, would God allow this guy to do it? Now, where do you get the answer to that? It turns out the answer to that is often in the fallout. So you learn something about human nature in the fuse leading up to the crime, and something about the nature of, if you don't believe in God, okay, then the nature of life. If you do believe in God, the nature of God in the fallout, because sometimes it's not till 20, 30, 40 years later that you see the consequence. Like, what did this end up producing? And it can produce good or bad. I have seen people who suffer a terrible tragedy, and it triggers something unexpectedly remarkable and good. They just didn't see it coming. And it tells us something then about the nature of God and how God works, or the nature of, if you don't believe in God, the nature of life and how the consequences, then you got to try to figure out, well, why would the consequences be this way? I think the better explanation is God. But my point is, the fuse teaches us about us, the fallout teaches us about him. And we can actually, that's what we're trying to do in this book, is kind of just look at, hey, what motivates us? Why are we so stupid, consistently stupid? And then two, what does this tell us about the nature of God?
So when you're talking about the fuse, and I definitely want to explore the nature of God and that piece of it toward the end, but I want to talk about the fuse piece of it first, because there's the implication that we do the same thing over and over again for a reason. But I read a book called People of the Lie, and it was a clinical psychiatrist that wanted to prove that evil existed outside of a Christian or religious context, and he wanted to prove that from a secular point of view, evil existed. And I thought he did a very compelling job of it. So there seems to be that there are people out there that are, whether it's something mental or spiritual or something, they're just evil. I mean, you could look at serial killers as an example. Honestly, I think hitmen are worse than serial killers, but they're just more glorified on it. But they kill just as many. So, but there seems to be almost something like wrong with their switch that says this is wrong. How does the fuse work for people like that? And what lessons can we learn in those situations?
Okay, so there's only three things you and I, you know from my work what I'm going to say here. The three things that cause us to do stupid things, the three motives for stupid, are simply the pursuit of sexual desire and lust and relationships, financial greed and wealth and experiences that are based on what you can afford, and then finally the pursuit of power. Those are the only three motives in the fuse. There's not a fourth motive. Oh, what about jealousy? Well, what are you jealous about? What about revenge? What are you vengeful about? It's going to fall back to one of those three things. So we know now what, so here's what I would say. Every single crime I've ever worked in, there's a chapter about this. It's a chapter that involves a guy named Santa Claus.
Yeah. I was going to talk about that one. Yeah.
But it comes down to that every crime, every fuse is simply a matter of misplaced devotion. The most crazy serial killer has misplaced his devotion. And when he's been designed by God to place his devotion in God, and we instead place it in something in the world, that's called idolatry in the scriptures, but it's really just misplaced devotion. But what do we place our devotion in? Something that God has created for our good, that we then twist and make it so utterly important that it becomes more important than the God who created it. And it's always going to be something in those three categories. So if I'm motivated by sexual desire and I'm a predator and I can't leave a trail of people who could, testify to my predatory nature, I'm going to end up being a serial killer who's now so consumed with power and sex that they have become his God. And the only way he can be satisfied is to scratch that itch. See, it turns out that all of the things we're looking for are actually satisfied in the designer. But as the designed, we often get caught up in other things that God has designed and has given us, and we miss, because everyone worships. Everyone worships. The only question is what you're going to worship. Either you're going to worship the God of the universe, and that has certain consequences, or you're going to worship something he's created, and that has certain consequences. And that's what we're trying to explore, at least in that one chapter.
So yeah, I want to talk about, because I think it's chapter 4 on Santa Claus. Because you have life lessons and death lessons throughout the book. So tell us, give us a little background on Santa Claus and kind of the life and death lesson from this. Because to me, there's something a lot more compelling when there doesn't seem to be. It almost feels irrational in a lot of these situations. I get in a bar fight with somebody, and because I'm drunk, and you hit on my wife, I punch you, you fall backward, you hit your head, and I kill you, something like that. There seems to be a rational basis behind that, but sometimes it just doesn't feel rational, even though there may be something that's so far removed or so deep internal that you don't understand it. So talk to us about that, and again, how we can actually learn from Santa Claus.
Well, okay, so we had a guy in our city named, they called him Santa Claus because he looked like Santa Claus, but he was actually a guy who was living on the street, and he was providing for he was a drinker, and he would provide for the one meal he would eat a day, and then whatever he would drink that day by collecting recyclables, cans. We called these folks canners in those days because that's what they would basically make most of their money on. They'd take these cans to the recycling center. So they were digging through trash all day till about 2:00, cash out the cans, then he'd have enough money to buy and drink the rest of the day. And that was his pattern for years. Now, here's the thing about it. You're right. There are times when a murder seems irrational, and it's because probably that 99% of the time, it's because somebody who committed the murder has an irrational worship of something that God has created. So this guy, I'm thinking, okay, we know it's only murders are caused by sex, money, and power. Sex, money, and power. So what does this guy offer the killer? He gets killed one day, and stabbed to death. He dies in front of a liquor store. And that's who's my suspect? What do you gain from killing this guy in the categories of sex, money, or power? He has no position in culture. He doesn't have any money, and he's not the object of a sexual desire. So what is it that was the motive for this crime? Well, it turns out that as he was canning, he slipped into another person, another canner, another guy living on the street, who considered those alleys that Santa Claus had started to kind of mine from those trash cans. He considered those his territory. There's like a territorial kind of thing on the street that's occurring sometimes. And so he confronted Santa Claus at a recycling center and said to him, "Hey, stop, knock it off. Don't be canning in my section." And Santa Claus, being a guy who'd been on the street forever and a lot older than this guy, kind of blew it off. Just kind of didn't disrespect him, just did not give him much ear. Right. And so as a result, he took this as an insult in front of his other friends. So what is you would think? So you're telling me that a guy would be willing to kill for how much money is he making a day in cans from those two alleys? $1?
Right.
You can kill for $1 and the fact you were disrespected at a canning recycling center. Well, yeah, you do it if those have become kind of the objects of your devotion. If you think too much of things in the categories of sex, money, and power and turn them into idols, because there is no God that you worship. Instead, you worship the things that God has created. And those things, by the way, are good. We just twist them into bad. Well, then you will kill for $1 and the disrespect in front of a couple of friends who live on the street. That's the problem. And so it seems like, yeah, that's an irrational murder. But the reality of it is, it's just that somebody is looking at those things irrationally. And that's why they end up doing these things. And so for me, it just taught me a lesson that well, number one, as a guy who's trying to solve murders, I'm always looking in those three categories. And I don't ever minimize how somebody could distort one of those three and do a murder for what seems like nothing to us. So I get that. That's part of it.
Right.
But also, I think it helps me to realize, and David Foster Wallace, who's an author, who was doing a commencement speech, and he basically talked, as not a believer, to my knowledge, but he talked about how everyone worships. And this huge university, he was telling everybody that everyone worships. You got to be careful about what you worship. If you worship, for example, your appearance, your sexual allure, you will die a million deaths as you age and see yourself in the mirror. If you worship your intellect or your status, well, then you'll constantly be feeling like a fool who's lording over others to maintain your position. If it's all about money, you'll feel like you never have enough. You'll always want more. This is the problem with putting your worship in something other than the designer who created us, who is the true object of worship. So I think that in the end, you'll see that just from a principle of living, if you would say, if you didn't believe in God, you would at least say that it's not wise to make overly important categories of sex, money, and power, because they'll just eat you alive. And that's what Foster Wallace was saying. He's not related to me, but the point is, I think he was very wise. Now, he's a guy who wrote great fiction books, and even his last book was even nominated for a Pulitzer, but he ultimately committed suicide. And I don't know that it has anything to do with this struggle that we all feel, but I do know this. This is a principle for living that is in Scripture. There's a reason why. I always thought, as I was growing up, when people would talk about idolatry, not being a Christian, it made no sense to me. And then when I became a Christian, I wondered, why is this such a big deal? Why is it one of the 10 commandments? It's because, of course, God knows what's best for us. And he knows that when we start to worship something other than him, it always goes sideways.
It's interesting that when you say that, because I argue that I think the biggest fear that we have is it's like at the end of Scooby-Doo when they take the mask off and they reveal who you are. Like, we all have that fear that you're going to take that mask off, that you're going to see that I'm not as smart as I am, or I'm not as confident as I am. And so we're always having, and it's our image, and I think social media has exaggerated that. So then when you attack me and my image, it's almost a form of self-defense. It's almost justifiable in my mind. Do you find, even with those three categories, do you find that to be an underlying cause, that they almost feel justified because they worship those three things to such levels?
Well, then there's no doubt about this. Now, look, a lot of it is in a different chapter, the chapter I wrote on identity, because I struggle with this too. And I think what happens is, that's an identity issue, right? Like, don't you dare challenge. Every time someone experiences a trauma, they don't realize it, but they're also experiencing an identity shift. This is super important to figure out, that you will, and this is about identity, because you and I, look, what are we doing right now? We're talking, we're our faces. It's who you're listening to. It's about, and who do I think I am? Who am I to write a book like this? A lot of this is about identity, right? And when that gets challenged, because we've made too much of this. So here's what I noticed is that when I work with officers who are retiring or who are injured, we do a lot of this on the summers, Billy Graham Association, serving with marriages that are sideways of officers who have been critically injured. Well, what part of the injury is that when you get injured, how you see yourself shifts. I'm a married man, for example, not anymore. So if you've been divorced, you'll see your identity shifts. I've never been sick. Well, not anymore. Things that are traumatic change the way that you think about you as an identity issue. Now, what's interesting is the inverse is also true. The identity shifts cause trauma. So I tell young people all the time, if you really want to experience less trauma in your life, simply pick an identity that won't shift. Because this idea of selecting who we are and trying to filter that out and then experiencing it, no, that doesn't work, and trying it on like hats is a traumatic way to live your life. It'll be full of challenges. You won't have the kind of stability you would have if you just figure out who you are early. And then it needs to be in something that is immutable, something that can't shift.
Right.
And that's, of course, why we would say that to put your identity in. And here's what happens. So you and I might say, okay, you see yourself some way. I see myself as author of. I used to see myself purely as detective at whatever agency. And so you see yourself this way. And then you start to lose track. Because let's put it this way, wherever you worship, that's where you're going to find your identity. It's just really as simple as that. It all comes back to that worship issue, that devotion issue. If you love soccer, you're playing it all the time. You see yourself as a soccer player. It's the thing you love. It's the thing you invest in. So I think for us who are out speaking in culture, we have to be really careful that doesn't become how we see ourselves, because in the end, it means it's self-worship.
Right.
And so for me, for example, as a public speaker, the first thing I had to do in the last 2 years is ask myself, okay, why am I? The more you speak publicly, the more you'll be enamored with your own speech. I had simply had to say no. I want to write, but is there a way to do this where the focus is not so solely on me as a speaker, but is more on the ideas that I'm trying to uncover? Like, that's the trick. If you can somehow do that, you will then take yourself out of the spotlight, and it's going to be better for you. So that's why I also got one in chapter on the issue of celebrity, and I think that's another, because what happens for us as identifying ourselves in this public realm is at some point it's celebrity is the cancer that will eventually eat you alive too.
You know, it took me a while to learn this. I became a Christian late in life. I was 40. So, you know, and then trying to understand what it meant to be a Christian. And it finally recognized that it ties into my identity. My identity is a child of God. That doesn't change. But if my identity is, well, I'm this business owner, my identity is I'm a speaker or a writer or I'm a husband, all that stuff can be changed, and all that stuff God can take away in order to remind you of who your identity really is. If I would trust in that identities and those things, then you're right. It is extremely traumatic when I lose that, and it's upsetting. I think some of young people now identify themselves honestly with those three things that you're talking about. You know, because you see their identity tied up with sex. I think that's where we find that the transgender, or that I can have sex with anybody without consequence from it. You see it tied up with greed of this is what my worth is. You know, so all this stuff that I see seems to be tied to identity. What do we do with it? I mean, you know, you can look at it from this kind of an external view because you're looking at things that have already happened. But now we got to kind of look at it moving forward, and we have to try to learn from it and prevent it. So what advice do you give going forward on this?
Yeah, it's hard. So I think there's three ways we typically form identity, and the researchers kind of have talked about at least two of them. You know, outside in, where we look outside ourselves and we say, yeah, I like that group and I want to be one of them. That's a very traditional way of forming identity. Or inside out, this is who I believe I am. My heart tells me this. You must all now accept what my heart tells me. Or topside down, right, where we identify in something that's bigger than us, that transcends us, that doesn't change, that is super stable because it hasn't changed. Well, I think the third choice is by far the best choice. But here's what I would say. Even you and I as Christians who came to faith late, I was 35, you were 40. Okay. I think that it's really hard to live it, because I would tell you, yeah, my identity is in Christ, but my actions give it away. Because in the end, my actions show you, just in how I budget my time, it's going to show you what I worship. And you can argue, well, yeah, but I'm doing this to grow the kingdom. No. Okay, your kingdom work, your identity as a pastor, as a speaker, as an author is entirely different than your identity in Christ. So how do you move from the things that even those of us who are chasing God on a practical daily basis, we end up in our identity in something else? So that's when you go to a party, you're probably the last thing you might have a conversation with a stranger for 5 minutes and never mention that you're a Christ follower. But you will mention your job, your hobbies, your wife, your family structure, your kids, number of kids. Those are the things we met. Those are the things that those are the hats we wear. And we think that Christianity is just another hat. I'll put it this way. We think that we have these labels that are like signs on a post.
Right.
And we can interchange their priority. Today I'm father first, employee second, yeah. But Christianity is not one of those signs. Christianity is the post that you're nailing the signs to.
I love that.
So there's the
I love
problem is
that.
that we don't see it this way. And in the end, we take it for granted. By the way, whenever time you've driven by a sign, you've paid no attention to the post. You paid no attention to what's even holding the sign up. You just care about the sign. Well, that's the problem I think we have here. And here's what God does. God says, you know what? I can certainly knock all those signs off the post if you want me to. And he did that with Job.
Yes.
And in the end, that's an identity story. Job is largely an identity story. So we have to figure out, like, before God knocks the signs off the post, how can we live in a way that's different? Now, here's what it's going to mean. And it's hard because if you're a younger guy, I'm now in my 60s, so I'm not working hard to make a living anymore. I have a pension. So I'm in a completely different place than I was 20 years ago, where it turned out that I had to spend 60, 70 hours a week working murders because that's how I paid the bills. And
Right.
if you're going to do that, it's going to be super hard not to find your identity in your successes and failures on the job. So I get this. This is going to be a struggle, and I think God knows that. So, but in the end, it's about surrender. It's about, and you can at least do this. At least when you have the opportunity to identify yourself, make a conscious effort to think of God first. It's easier to act your way into feelings than to feel your way into actions. So how about this? Let's just change. For example, do you have social media right now? What's it say on there? Like, what are you posting about? Like, for years, I had detective and author and all those titles that the world gives you were in the primary positions in my bio. Okay, the least I can do is rearrange that. The least, and now I got to try to live it, and it's hard
Right.
to do. I think that is the struggle. That is the life. So let me just finish this idea up here. I think there's way that the Christian life is basically, the justification, that moment in which you are freed from the penalty of sin, and then sanctification, that period of time in which you are freed from the overarching power of sin, and then finally glorification, that moment when you are freed from the presence of sin. So those are the stages of the Christian life. Well, it turns out that first one, justification, is a door that you walk through in an instant when you accept Christ as Savior. That last one, glorification, is a door you walk through in an instant when you die and go in front of your Father. But that thing in the middle, called sanctification, is not a door. That is a really crooked, dangerous hallway that you have to walk. And in that hallway, you're going to forget who you are a number of times. You're going to bump against the walls a number of times. You're going to slip and fall a number of times. But it's in the hallway that you learn how to become the kind of Christian that you always read about in Scripture. And that's and Paul will tell you, because he said it, every time I want to walk the hallway straight, I don't. It's like a human condition I've discovered. Yeah, that's true. It's in Romans, 7, at the end of Romans 7. So I think the reality of it is that we have to be able to walk the hallway. That means that don't expect to master the identity thing. But if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. We have to at least try.
No one gets on top of Mount Everest by taking a stroll.
Yeah.
We have to work on that. The problem is we have these expectations that are placed on us, that parents place on us. I know you talk about fatherhood, and I'd love to get in that more, but recently we just literally this past weekend we attended an event there was a lot of storms. It was a dangerous situation, and everyone was more focused on the event than the safety of people. And it was like there was very few voices that were willing to speak out. Mine was happened to be one of them, and I just felt like everybody was against me. And even when I knew I was doing right, I felt like I was doing wrong. So
Yeah.
when we're dealing with this, and then you add to it of the fact of, I had a father that taught me right and wrong. I have a holy father, a heavenly father, that teaches me right and wrong. So how do we manage that when we have all these voices? And now again, you add social media, you add this idea of the celebrity type thing, you add all this stuff, all these lessons that you have, these 15 parts of your book. It seems like it's just too overwhelming for one individual to handle, to take on.
Yeah, it's like so here's what I would say. It turns out that most of the principles of wisdom we talk about, and the first chapter in this book is about, like, what is wisdom? What qualifies as wisdom? We all want to do what's wise, but there are certain components that even secular studies will show you are involved in wisdom. One of them is that wisdom has to be grounded in some kind of virtuous pillar, a moral pillar, because otherwise you end up saying stupid things, which I hear in the criminal world all the time. Like, what's the wisest way to commit a kidnapping? Well, it seems like that's a stupid question, right? Because isn't it by its very definition unwise to commit a kidnapping? Well, that's because there's a moral pillar. There's a moral sense in wisdom. But then the question becomes, well, how do you ground the moral sense? Because there's gangsters who will talk about the wisest way to commit a robbery or the wisest way to do a kidnapping. It's because their moral pillar is defined by them. It turns out that we're looking for a moral standard that's grounded in something that transcends individuals and transcends groups. The true wisdom has to be grounded in an objective moral attitude, an objective moral truth that can't be grounded in things that are subjective, like subjects. So that means you're talking about that the Christian worldview at least has an offer it could make. So when we think, hey, we're distracted, yeah, we are distracted by a lot of things that make it hard to live wisely. But it turns out, you'll see in Proverbs, I'm going through all Proverbs with my granddaughter and my daughter right now. And if you get to read through Proverbs, the first 9 chapters, here's what you're going to find. You're going to find that moral truth is available to you. Wisdom is available to you. And it's going to require you to not be distracted by all and this is often said, it's not just that, yes, you need to seek wisdom. You need to resist all the other stuff because that bombardment is occurring. And I tell you, I think we are headed toward a generation that will swing back from the oversaturation we have of media that's available at the end of our arm. We're going to have to make choices to limit the distractions, not to say I'm never going to be involved in this thing, but to say I'm going to put parameters on how much I am going to be involved. That's just wise to do. I think also we're on the verge of another generation. We're in the information age now, but that's about to end. We're in the AI age, the artificial intelligence age. And I think what's going to happen is we are going to have an unbelievable distrust for anything that's not sitting directly in front of us. Even this, at someday, I could probably just have you call my AI agent and it will appear like me to do an interview. Right. And you won't even know if it's me.
Right.
But it turns out that if I was in your presence, you would at least know if it's me, at least at this generation, what it's me until we had developed that technology too. But I think we're going to end up, I think this whole Gen Z and the Gen Alpha that's following them are going to have a renewed interest in things that aren't digital, including intelligence, because they don't know what they can trust anymore. Right. And the one thing you are seeing, even in this information age, is that young people are less trusting because there's so much saturation out there. Who do you trust? Parents, if you're listening, this is the time. And this is why I did a chapter on fatherhood. It turns out that when your kids come to distrust all the voices, they are going to end up leaning into the voices with whom they have strong relationships. It's just the nature of it. What are you distrusting? The voices of unknowns. Because there's so many. And this one seems smart, and that one seems smart. So in the end, is there someone who's got my genetic material who has lived to a older age, and has done it successfully? Maybe I just want to follow his advice or her advice. And I think that we're going to return at some point. Maybe this is just the old man thinking this, but I think we are going to return to some point in the primacy of your role as a parent. And this is also going to require us to rethink. We are now a culture that thinks more of your role as an employee than you think of your role as a parent. Because we are far more invested in our jobs than we are in our kids.
Right.
So we're going to have to return to something that's ancient. By the way, all the secular studies will talk about the role that parenting plays in raising well-adjusted kids, like duh. And even the role that fathers play. You can deny that fathers have an important role to play, but it takes 2 biological parents of different genders to actually raise kids in the most robust fashion. Anything else is a compromise. Well, why? Because it's not cultural. It's not because the culture is deeming it inappropriate. It's because of your biochemistry, which you're not going to change. That you can try to dampen the estrogen testosterone difference, but the reality of it is that's what drives the difference in parenting. And those 2 things together make for the best human union. The one by itself is not good either way. It's together we are created in the image of God. Why would that be? Because we seem to be so biochemically puzzled. We come together biochemically and we raise our kids differently. There are certain things as a father that I can teach my sons. I can't do what my wife does. Thank God, because they'd be a mess if it was just me.
Right.
But they would also be a mess if it was just her. It turns out we both have a role to play.
Well, I appreciate this. We're at the end of the time. People want to find out about this book or some of the other great books they have. I mean, I'm assuming you go to Amazon. I know you go to Amazon because I've read you had some amazing reviews on there. Where else can they get your book and find out more about you and what the work you're doing?
Well, our website is coldcasechristianity.com from the first book, but we have a website also, thetruthandtruecrime.com. But in the end, I always tell people, look, I'm very uncomfortable selling books because there's a celebrity aspect of that. I'm writing books because I'm writing to me. If they help you, great. But I'm still the first person who's trying to learn this stuff. But here's what I would say. We've got a ton of free stuff at our website. Exhaust it. Exhaust that website, all the free videos, articles, and podcasts. And then, of course, we do deep dive in books. If that helps you, great. You can find everything at coldcasechristianity.com.
I will tell you, I heard you speak here at MTSU in Murfreesboro. You put up the text code to get the information on it. It's absolutely incredible information. For those who are listening, I highly recommend, again, get his book, Cold Case Christianity, Person of Interest, and obviously this one as well. Again, I love the way you put it on paper. It's easy to digest, and and you're able to do it in a way that makes it where you're not looking at it as like I'm reading some big theological manuscript. Like you're doing it where everybody can understand. So I greatly appreciate how you put it out in perspective and how you look at things. It's just is nice, and it fits in the genre of true crime really well, because partly it is. So, but again, I appreciate all that you're doing, and let us know if we can ever be of help to you in any more going forward.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just glad to be partnering with you to do this work in the culture. So I appreciate being here.
Well, thank you.